Welcome, this is Jake with Genesis Rage, and in this user requested video we'll go over how to set up and use the optional config file for SmartFox. Here I've already created an empty sfs-config XML file. We'll open that in MonoDevelop. And all the elements here will be contained in a SmartFox config. So we'll create that. And the config file requires a couple tags here. First one being IP. And we'll set that to 127.0.0.1 because we're just running this locally as right now. We also need port. We'll leave that the default 9933. And in the config file documentation, it only says you need IP, port, and zone. However, at the time of this filming, you also need UDP port or UDP IP, and we're just going to leave that 127.0.0.1, and you also need UDP port, and we'll leave that 9933. And then lastly, we'll put in zone. We'll call that SmartFox, if I can spell correctly, videos, which is actually a zone I have set up on the server. And that's all we need for this file, so we'll save that out and switch back over into our connect script. We're going to add a couple public variables up here just so we can access stuff from the inspector. The first one we're going to name public string, and we're going to call this config file. I'm going to set that to _scripts /_network /sfs-config.xml. And that's just where I have it saved locally on my computer right now. And we'll also create a public bool. We'll use this, or set this to use config file, and by default we'll leave that as false. Now we're going to come into our start method right before we try to connect. We're going to add a couple lines here. First we're going to ask if use config file. If so, we want to go sfs.loadConfig. And here we're actually going to use a Unity property called application.datapath. And you can check the documentation on Unity's website on where that data path actually points to for your operating system and build target. And we're going to add a slash, then add our config file, like so. Now, the load config method will actually take in an optional boolean that if you set it to true, it will automatically connect, but we want to handle that manually, so we're just going to leave it the default here. I'm going to come down and go else. So, if we're not using the config file, we're just going to connect like we have in previous videos. Now we have that set in place, we're going to actually create our handlers. So right above our onLogin method, we're going to create a couple more. First one we're going to name onConfigFail, and like with all SmartFox events, it takes in a type of base event, and this does not return any parameters, so we're just going to go debug.log, and we're going to log out failed to load config file. That's all we need for this one. Come up here, create another one, and we'll call that on config load. Takes in a base event. And this one doesn't return any parameters either, but we're going to go ahead and debug log. And we'll say config file loaded. And this is where we want to manually connect. So we're going to go sfs.connect. And here we're going to actually send new objects of sfs.config.host and sfs.config .port. And that's all we're going to need for the handlers. So we'll come up here and add to the event listeners. So sfs dot add event listener of sfs event. This is config load success, and we'll send that to on config load. Another one for the sfs event, config load failure, and we'll send that to on config failed. Now, because the config file actually has zone information, we're going to come down to our onConnection method here, and where we actually log into the zone, we're going to add a couple lines right above that. Go if use config file. We're actually going to set zone name to equal sfs.config.zone. So we'll set the zone name to whatever's in the config file and log into the zone. And that's all we'll need here. So we'll save this file out, switch over into Unity, and because we set the use config file to false, we'll come up here, select our main camera, and check it here. And then we'll go ahead and hit play. You see it looks much like before. However, it says here, config file loaded, successfully connected, and we're logged in. So that will wrap up this video, and thanks for watching.